all seen Josh's programs before, and he's really a master teacher and a master birder. So, master photographer. So we've got the whole package here. Generally, at the beginning of the programs, I read our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. So we want everyone to know that they're welcome to be part of our community. Our community is broad and large, and we love the diversity of all types of people who are birders. The birds Washtenaw Audubon pledges to protect differ in color, size, behavior, geographical preference, and countless other ways. As we honor and celebrate the equally remarkable diversity of the human species, Washtenaw Audubon considers the work of inclusion, diversity, and equity a top priority moving forward. We hope that in doing so, we can bring new creativity and energy to our work in Washtenaw County and beyond for birds and people alike. Respect, inclusion, and opportunity for people of all backgrounds, lifestyles, and perspectives will attract the best ideas and harness the greatest passion to shape a healthier, more vibrant future for all of us who share our planet. We believe that protecting and conserving nature and the environment transcends political, cultural, and social boundaries. As an organization, we are committed to increasing the diversity of our board, volunteers, members, and supporters. As an organization, Washtenaw Audubon strives to create a sense of community where all people can feel safe to explore nature and experience the wonder of birds. We respect the individuality of each member of our community and welcome all without discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, age, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, disability, national or ethnic origin, politics, or veteran status, or any other status. All are welcome to bird with us and learn with us and to share in our passion for birds and the environment. We're going to take a moment to talk about the field trips we have coming up. I want to recognize our Secretary, Jessica Adamczyk, who's running our Zoom today and is doing technical advice. Mike Sefton, our Vice President and Program Chair. Dana Novak is our Stewardship Chair. She's selling t-shirts in the back. Diana Miller is our membership chair. So if you want to join tonight and you're not a member, check with Diana and she'll get you squared away in that regard. Pardon? Sherry Smith is a board member at large and she does bird rescue for us. Keith Dickey over here in the front row is our treasurer. So we've got good board representation tonight. Thanks to all the board people who have come. Interesting bird sightings we always do, and I'm hoping somebody has a good one. We had a Connecticut warbler on the May count on Saturday at Saline Fisheries Research Station, so that was super fun. And lots of cool birds are coming through still. We seem to be at the tail end of warblers already. Could it happen in 1 or 2 days and then it's gone? It seemed to have happened like that this year. It seems that because of the weather patterns we had here in Michigan, the birds migrated north on the west side of Lake Michigan through Wisconsin and Minnesota. So that's a thing. Maybe we'll get a really great fall show. Anybody else have any interesting bird sightings? Very nice. Josh says he had a yellow-throated warbler in the Kalamazoo area. Yeah, and Roger had a yellow-throated warbler at Saline Mills on Saturday. We went there last night and we didn't hear it, but Raj and Mike Helb had it on Saturday, and that's what counts for our May count. Thanks for that, Raj. We have, yes, Mike.
Well, I haven't seen it, but there's a non-blowing vireo in Muskegon County.
Oh, yes.
Lewis is Woodpecker, resident species,
Yep, so there's a Lewis's woodpecker in Muskegon County. If you're chasing birds, this is a mind-blowing record, only the 4th record for the state of Michigan. So get out there and go see it. I'll join you if I can. We have a lot of great field trip still coming up this month. Again, Thursday mornings, everyone knows about the Thursday morning walks at the ARB. If you don't, check the website. Sunday, Matt will be taking us back to the ARB. Matt Spohr, our field trip chair. Tuesday evening birders, we have 2 more Tuesdays. We're going to Embry Road next week, and the following week we'll be doing grassland birds, hopefully with Dan Sparks Jackson. This Saturday, we have a BIPOC bird walk for Black, Indigenous, and people of color and allies. That's going to be probably in the morning or the afternoon on Saturday. Check the website. We also have a beginning birder walk from the Traverwood branch of the Ann Arbor District Library. We'd love to have everybody come out to our events. It's super fun when more people come. Everything we do except for this hybrid program is outside, so it's pretty safe to be out there together. Mike's going to introduce our speaker, Josh Haas. We're really super happy to have here. And Mike, would you come up and let us know who else we have coming in terms of programs for the rest of the spring? Thank you.
We're for June, Don the Man Chalfant will give one of his talks. Very popular speaker. He's going to talk about his quest for seeing 300 birds in Washtenaw County. And that's all we have. There are no programs in July or August. And I'll announce the speakers for September and afterwards on the website in the not too distant future. But tonight we're happy to have Josh Haas. Josh has been seriously birding and photographing birds for the last 17 years, often with his family. And tonight he's going to give us some tips on identifying spring warblers and vireos. Please welcome Josh Haas.
Gosh, I hate these masks. But boy, do we wear them. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. And I have to tell you, it's so great to see such a great board turnout to a meeting. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. So that should look a lot better for those in the room. Yeah, I like that. So anyway, what I was saying is so nice to see so many of your board members here. That's really nice to see. Is someone who's been on and run a board. It can be difficult. So cheers to you folks. That's really good to see that. I'm also happy to share that this is officially my first speaking engagement in person since before COVID. So I'm really happy to be here, and cheers to you folks for really working hard at making it hybrid. I think that's wonderful, and we should see that whether there's a pandemic or not, because not everybody can join us. So that's really wonderful. So, you know, I'm typically known as the raptor guy. So I guess I'll be a closet warbler and vireo nerd tonight. But the reality is I'm just a birder, and I love birds, and I'm absolutely fascinated with migration. I mean, there's nothing cooler than migration. And even putting this talk together, I learned some things. And that's a key point that I want to start with tonight. Be willing to learn, even if you think of yourself as an expert. I'm not an expert on warblers and vireos, but I'll tell you, I am excited to share some of the tips that I use for determining who I'm hearing or who I'm seeing in the forest. So I hope that you walk away with something of an aha moment tonight that helps. Now, having said that, you know, it's important to start with the basics. And I'm not going to belabor this because, you know, we're not here for a basic birding 101, but I do want to point out that, you know, there are some key basic, getting back to basics is really important. And there's some key traits, key lessons that you need to apply in the field that can come in handy, even when you don't have a goose, something the size of a goose. By the screen here, you can see we're focused on house sparrow type birds. It's that size of a bird that we're looking at. But it's really important to know that sometimes our minds trick us. And I'll tell you, have you ever had someone find out you're a birder and their story is typically either an owl that they've seen or a bald eagle? And the owls stand this tall, if you didn't know, okay? And the eagle is, the size of that wall. Now, it's funny to us because we know that's not true, but at the end of the day, our mind can play tricks on us in thinking that we saw something a lot larger than we actually did. It happens to me even today after, almost 2 decades of birding. So don't be afraid to go back to the basics and just stop for a second and realize, okay, what did I see? How did it compare in size and shape to the trees that it's around or whatever else that's there? But more importantly, especially in terms of warblers and vireos, it's vital that you key in on some details. One in particular is the beak. Okay, so tonight we're going to go through a lot of warblers. We're going to go through some vireos, but I'm also going to kind of have a spattering of how do we decipher a warbler versus a vireo, and then the tough vireos and how we determine that it's, say, a warblering versus a Philadelphia or something like that. So we're going to kind of play in those worlds tonight. So in terms of the details here, as you can see on screen, hopefully you can look closely to see a much more stout, relative to the warbler here, a much more stout bill that has a little hook on the end. Now, depending on where you're seeing the bird in the canopy, you might never see that hook. But I will say it's pretty easy with optics to see the more stout, hardy looking bill on a vireo, okay? Now, we also need to consider our habitat. We're going to learn about several warblers tonight that cross all sorts of boundaries in terms of habitat. Oftentimes when you talk about warblers, our minds immediately would go to the upper canopy, the upper story, where we're looking straight up and we have warbler neck, right? But that's not always the case. We're going to talk about redstarts and hooded warblers tonight, oven birds, 3 of which actually prefer the understory. So we have to think in terms of a field guide as more than just a photo of the bird that we're looking at. Read about their behavior, read about the habitat that they reside in or migrate through. Sometimes it's different depending on if they're on nesting grounds or in their migration. So just be willing to read more into the birds that you're looking at or looking for prior to going out. It's really vital to learn, especially the habitat and behavior. Now, when it comes to behavior in terms of warblers and vireos, just generally speaking, warblers typically have that aura of never sitting still. And as soon as someone sees this great bird, you are 2 steps away and it's already gone. And so that tends to be that quick reaction to hearing, oh, there's a warbler. I know it's going to be flitting around, jittery, moving around like crazy. However, vireos tend to be sit and wait type hunters. So if you have a bird that you at first think is a vireo, or excuse me, a warbler, and it's sitting very still and it's not preening, it's not doing something, different, you likely have a vireo and you should reconsider the family that you thought you had. And so it's really important to look for those behavior traits and all of those things. We talked about size and shape, habitat that you're seeing the bird, and behavior. The first 3 things that we've gone through have nothing to do with the colors that we're going to see on these birds. And to me, those first 3 things are much more important than the colors. And the colors become the final pieces of the puzzle that we need to figure out what we're looking at. And my style of teaching birding is basically rolled up into one statement: figure out what it's not. And more often than not, that helps me to really narrow the field down to just a handful of species that then I can go through this kind of stepped process to figure out who exactly I'm looking at. Now, if you're pretty good with bird songs, that can give you, in most cases, a definitive ID before you even see the bird. And don't be afraid to learn bird songs, regardless of how experienced you are, because your lists will just go up exponentially by sound. So we're not going to go through bird songs, in terms of how to learn bird songs tonight, but I am going to feature songs for all the species that we're going to go through tonight. So as a birder, we have to have some sort of, guide, whether it be a book or an app. This is, the field guides, we're kind of always at odds in my household. My wife loves books. She's always been a book nerd. So I think that by default, she likes to have a paper field guide with her at all times. Me, I don't want any of that. I have my phone. I've got all the apps I like, and I'm happy. Part of that is because I always have a lot of camera gear. It's like one more thing to carry. I can do it all on my phone. It's a wonderful thing. But don't be afraid if you're, preferring a actual paper book, bring one with you, but limit it. Don't bring the entire Sibley guide to North America with you in the field. Bring the Eastern if you're east of the Mississippi, or bring the Western if you happen to be traveling in California. As I mentioned, I really prefer the apps. I always get the question from everybody, which app do you use? What's the best one? Well, I can't answer that because I use them all in essence. And the 4 that I have here listed are primarily the 4 that I use, and I use them all for different reasons. So the Audubon Field Guide to Birds and iBird Pro, these are outdated versions, but these are kind of the just general go-to guides that are nice, that gives you photos, illustrations, nesting and breeding behavior, migration patterns, all that kind of stuff, range maps. The third one here, though, is a lot less used, I think, and it's the Peterson Field Guide to Birds in North America. And I love the Peterson guide because if you recall opening your Peterson Field Guide book, they're set up in plates. And so you get a group of warblers that are all similarly colored. So all the yellow ones are together, all the striped or birds with wing bars might be together. And now you have a page or a screen on your phone or tablet that you can look at many birds at a time. Whereas the other apps and guides are one bird at a time. And so I find that to be a little bit more difficult. The same thing is true for Sibley in that it's one bird at a time, but Sibley offers this really cool feature, if you're not familiar with it, called the comparison, or COMP as it's on the app itself. So when you're in the app, you search for your bird. In this case, I typed in TENN for Tennessee Warbler. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see COMP. So I'm going to click on that. That stands for compare or comparison. Now a little circle comes up. I click the circle. Now I have Tennessee Warbler checked. So I'm going to go back to my search screen, get rid of TENN, and now I'm going to type in WARB, thinking I want to search for warbling vireo, because this is a pairing that can be very troublesome. Now I find my warbling vireo. I click on that, and guess what? Now I can compare these 2 birds side by side. And if you don't like the look of this, where it's on top of each other, to me, that doesn't make sense. They should be to the side of each other if it's a side-by-side comparison. All you do is turn your phone sideways, and now you have it truly side by side. The coolest part that I'm not going to show here is I can actually swipe through each bird, and I can compare a female to a male, depending on the species, if they're sexually dimorphic. I can compare juvenile to adult, or in this case, we see a brighter adult from the east in the warbling vireo. There's actually a drab adult from the east that we could compare to the Tennessee as well. And when you're done here, you could compare the warbling vireo to a Philadelphia vireo if you want. It's only 2 at a time, but it's an amazing feature in this app, and I use it all the time on bird walks with folks. So don't be afraid to check that out. If you really want to take it to the next level, I talked about bird songs. Larkwire is a great tool to check out. And basically, it's an app that you can set up to have it test you and your knowledge of bird songs. So you hit play once you have either certain types of birds selected, or you can tell it to just randomly pick whatever. You can put in individual species you want to work on. So 3 that come to mind that tend to be tough are rose-breasted grosbeak, scarlet tanager, right? We're getting there. You could put those in and just play it over and over, and it tests you and tells you how good you do or how bad you do. So that's a really nice tool that you can take to the next level. And I believe if you don't, if you're not a fan of smartphone technology, they actually have a website with an app online that you can use if you don't like to use your phone. Okay, so having said that, we're going to dive into eastern warblers. I am a bird photographer and I love warblers. It's not my favorite subject matter. However, I do love warblers, and I hope that you, even if you don't learn anything tonight, I hope you enjoy the visual side of this program tonight, because I've tried to include my nicest images of these birds. So when it comes to warblers, you know, these are typically the small, but usually really colorful birds that when someone outside of the birding world sees a bird like this, they think, where have I been transported? Am I in Central or in South America? This bird should not be in Michigan. I actually had that happen just last week while I was in McGee. A friend of mine was 5 miles offshore on Lake Michigan fishing, and he sent me a picture of this bird. He just had no clue what this thing was. A redstart landed on his little tiny boat and was just taking a break. 5 miles out to shore in the middle of the day, which is very odd. So who knows what was going on with this bird? But, you know, picture yourself as a non-birder like my friend is, seeing this brilliantly colored male, a bird he's never seen before. It's really cool, teachable moment. In addition to the colors that we often see, I mean, there are a few exceptions, of course, like we just talked through our Tennessee, that tends to be more drab. But in addition to the colors, they also tend to have that sharper, pointed, slender bill. Okay, so we're going to keep that in mind, and we're going to talk through that a lot tonight as we compare our warblers to our vireos. They're typically found in forest canopies, but you know what? That's not always the case, as we can see here with our common yellowthroat. If you've ever experienced yellowthroat, you really need to learn their song, because you're going to hear them probably 20 times more than you're going to see them. They don't like to come out. So wooded habitats, forest canopies, that's kind of where our mind goes. We go up, but that's not always the case for some of these birds. So you have to be willing to read a little bit about each species you think you have. As I mentioned earlier, they tend to be really, really flighty, jittery. Their hunting style is to go after insects. They don't sit and wait for them to come like the vireos do. So if you have a bird that you think is either a vireo or a warbler and it's all over the place going after insects, it's a safe bet you probably can throw out those vireos and you're looking strictly at warblers. And then you further narrow from there. So we're going to start with a low bird tonight. We're going to kind of work up from here, but this is named kind of timely, our American redstart. This is our male. And so interesting, you know, these birds, oftentimes, even when they're hunting insects, they'll rapidly spread their tail feathers. So if you've ever noticed those brilliant tail colors, they're doing this actually on purpose. In some cases, it'll expose that orange or yellow in the tail and it'll startle insects into flight. And so that's not just to show off their pretty colors, they're actually using it as a way to scare their prey. They are a long distant migrant, all the way from, you know, our neck of the woods here down to Central and South America. And, you know, these are like the miniature orioles, especially if you have a male. They tend to look like an oriole because of all that orange and black. The females, however, are a lot more dull, but they still have that little hiccup right there on the wing. Okay, very similar, and you'll see that in both the immature birds as well as the females. But as you can see, the females are more gray on top. They do have the orange more in the flanks. And when I say flanks, it's kind of the sides of the bird's body, right beneath where the wings lay. So we're going to talk about flanks a lot tonight. These guys are found in wooded habitats, deciduous forests, but they're typically lower and they like secondary succession. So they're going to be in thicker understory. It's not going to be that older growth forest where you can really stare through the forest. They're going to like the thicker stuff. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about songs tonight. Let's hear what the redstart sounds like. Very sweet, rising at the end. So that's our redstart. Next up is another low preferring warbler. Look at the beak. Would you consider that long, slender, and pointed, or short, stubby, and kind of portly? Well, I would say it's the former. It's very long and slender. Notice that eye stripe looks like kind of like the bandit. Sometimes we call the common yellowthroat the bandit bird, but I kind of look at this bird the same way. It is called the blue-winged warbler, and they do have blue wings, but it's more of a very subdued slaty blue. Notice the wing bars, that's really important. This is one of our yellow warblers, so we're going to struggle with the yellow guys like yellow warbler, common yellowthroat, hooded, blue-winged prothonotary. These are all yellow birds, but they all have subtle differences that we can look for. And what we're looking for in the blue-winged are those blue wings with white wing bars, as well as that thin spectacle or line that goes through the eye. They oftentimes will actually dangle from shrubs, similar to chickadees and titmice, pulling insects from different kinds of leaf matter. But they tend to be, again, similar to the redstart in that they're a shrubland specialist, but I find blue wings more often than not in grassland fields with lots of bushes, autumn olive, unfortunately, things like that. And it's typically near a wetland or water nearby. So let's hear what these sound like. If you have hearing loss, this will be one that's tough. Two buzzies, one buzz is low, one buzz is high. It's often very, very high pitched. Folks that I bird with, this is one they rarely hear. That's because I turned the shoot. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna turn it up a little bit. And if you start to hear an echo, let me know. But hopefully this will make it so they can hear the songs. Okay, I'm gonna go back one and play it again. All right, cool. And we don't have echo, so now we've made everybody happy. Let's hope. So next on our list of warbler, all of our warblers tonight is our pine warbler. And if you were here early enough to see our video montage at the beginning, we had a pine warbler featured. What I love about pine warblers is, you know, I'm a big cyclist and I ride the rural roads all the time. And I'll often just randomly come upon hearing a pine warbler, and I'll look up and immediately think, oh, pine warbler. I'm looking for this vast pine forest. And oftentimes I see this deciduous forest and a few pine trees just happen to be mixed in. And that's where a pine warbler is. And more often than not, that's where I find them. It's more deciduous forest with little groupings of pine trees mixed in. They're often very high up in pines, so you hear them more than you see them. It's another one to work on in terms of song. They're very, I consider it a pale yellow, but as is with everything in life, it's very relative. If you've ever experienced a pine warbler after seeing an American goldfinch kind of in the winter time, you think you've seen a yellow bird, and then bam, you see this really beautifully colored yellow pine warbler. It looks nothing like a goldfinch. Now, maybe a little different summer colors for a goldfinch, but it is pale considering some of the other yellow warblers, but it's a really rich, brilliant looking yellow. The females are actually quite drab, actually, and we're going to show that here in a second. They're one of the most drab warblers that you will see. In fact, so much so, every time I see what looks to be, a flash of a really drab warbler, I immediately think, oh, I wonder if that's a pine warbler female, because they're just so drab. So let's hear them. It's like a machine gun alarm, similar to our chipping sparrow, but it's much sweeter. It's a sweeter, repetitive machine gun kind of call. And that's our female that you can see on screen right now. Next is another yellowish colored bird, but with a strikingly black toned throat and chest. Yes. Oh, I can do that. No worries. Very sweet, ends on a high. And that's our red star. So back to our black-throated green, just a beautiful, beautiful bird. Prefers deciduous forests, especially slightly older growth forests. They're hard to find breeding around here, at least in our latitude. especially on the western side of Michigan. I don't know if you've got breeding black-throated greens here. It sounds like you do. We have them on the west side of the state, but it's very, very, very small, very hard to find. So very picky about where they breed, but that black throat is seen on both the males and the females. It's just a little bit duller on the females. The yellow as well, and the olive on the back of the female is going to be slightly duller as well. One of my favorite places to experience black-throated greens is Taos. And the beautiful thing about Taos Point, if you've never been, it's a lot of jack pines that aren't super tall. And so you see all these birds in the pines. It creates this really nice palette for the color of these birds. And the black-throated greens are low, where everywhere else I typically experience black-throated greens higher. So it's a nice place to experience them. They are found in mixed forests, but like I said, I've had really good luck in more older growth forests. Another buzzy call. Z, 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 Z. Z, 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 Z. Always rises, excuse me, at the end. All right, next on our list, this is one of my favorite birds because I seriously, every time I see a chestnut-sided warbler, all I can think of, especially with this individual here, all I can think of is like my 4-year-old sneaking into the paint cabinet and getting paint everywhere. That's a chestnut-sided warbler to me. And thankfully that's never happened in my house, but that's what the chestnut-sided looks like to me. And you know, I failed to say this at the beginning. Hopefully you're noticing I have range maps for every single one of these species. And you're recording this, right? Cool. So take note of that. I love range maps. They're super fun. Some of these you're going to see the birds are incredibly common. And then others, they have this crazy route where they breed in this, you know, northern boreal forest, and they're way down in South America. That's migration to me. It's just amazing. So be willing to look at that. Excuse me for that. So our males are white overall. Notice the chestnut-sided flanks. There's those flanks again, that kind of rufusy red. I love the yellow cap on these birds, though. Oftentimes you'll see them kind of go upside down or reach around a branch to get at insects, and they'll expose that cap. And you'll think, oh my gosh, a black cap chickadee with a yellow cap. It's just this beautiful, brilliant cap, but it's yellow. The females are really similar. They're just really pale. And so you'll still see some chestnut in the flanks on the females, but they tend to be a lot more pale. So these birds, you know, they're lower as well. And where they breed in the areas that I'm used to back on the west side of the state, it's always really secondary, kind of thick, successionary, scrubby stuff, thicket, very thick stuff where they're kind of, you'll hear them call and then they'll pop out. And so that's typically where I'll find chestnut-sided. Now, if you're going to a migration trap like the Arb or McGee Marsh or Taos, they're more mixed in with the groups of warblers in whatever habitat's there. So I'll see chestnuts low at McGee, but I'll also see them pretty high too. So they tend to just follow the insects when they're in migration. So their call is another sweet call, and it kind of sounds like they're saying, pleased to meet you at the end. So let's listen to that. Sounds like the bird has a stutter and then says, pleased to meet you at the end. Next up is a nice bird that, you know, while Juliet was talking about migration and the timing of things and how weather and winds can take the migration patterns one way or the other, especially around the Great Lakes, this is one that you still have a chance at. They tend to be a later migrant, and one that is also pretty secretive. They have a very, very high-pitched, repetitive call that if you can hear it, it's pretty easy to learn. But the problem is, when I said if you can hear it, it's one of the highest pitched warbler calls outside of maybe the end of a Blackburnian. And so it's going to be very hard if you've started to lose some of those high frequencies. You're going to have really struggle to hear blackpolls. And I really experienced that. I experience that often at migration stops. I'll hear blackpolls all over the place and no one knows they're there. It's very sad for me because I feel bad for them, but then I also think selfishly that's going to be me someday. I'm just really holding out that I've got enough time that technology is going to catch up and I'll have the hearing aids that can make it happen, but we'll see. So this is actually really a much smaller warbler. I shouldn't say much smaller, but smaller relative to the general warbler that we're used to seeing. They tend to look smaller, a little sleeker, and they look like kind of like a black-capped chickadee with warbler characteristics. So they've got that black cap. You see some white on the face. It's very indicative of a black-capped chickadee. But then you look to the body, the flanks, and the tail, and whoa, that can't be a black-capped chickadee. That's totally different. So if at first you think chickadee and then you see, oh, that's not a chickadee, it's likely going to be a black-polled warbler. Similar to the black-polls are going to be your black and whites, but they don't have the solid cap. They have a striped head in black and white. So if you see a black cap, but there's a white stripe going down the middle, throw out black-poll and you're looking at a black and white. Now, I love this bird. You've heard me say a couple times how much I love migration. This bird will, in many cases, fly nonstop over the Atlantic from, look at this range map. Can you, I mean, you're talking 15 to 1,800 miles in one flight. This is known as one of the longest distance warbler migrants around. And that just blows my mind. You know, when you hear things like that, or some of these shorebirds that will just take flight and 2 weeks later they set down. Can you imagine 2 weeks? Oh, that's migration for me. It's just so exciting. So these guys are found in the boreal forest, especially preferring tamarack forests. So I just got done with a tour in March up in northern Minnesota. And one of the things I noticed about the forests up there, thick with tamarack. And the whole time I'm thinking, man, this just must be thick with black-polls in migration. But you know, I don't know that for sure. But that's kind of where my head went. The females are similar, but they're paler and they actually are more tannish overall. So you're not going to see that contrasting white and black cap on the females. They're much more pale. But let's listen to their call. I'm going to be really quiet when I hit play because I'm hopeful that you can hear it. It's a very repetitive call, but it's very high pitched. It just played. It's playing again. And when you hear that in the field, they'll do lots of variations of that, but the same cadence and similarities are there in all the versions that they do. And interesting, at McGee last week, there were a lot of Tennessee warblers around, and there's kind of a secondary call the Tennessee will make that's repetitive like that, but it's harsher and it's not as high pitched. But I thought it was interesting. It was tricking me a little bit at first. So we're going to bring you back from the upper canopy down low again into our ovenbird. And if you're not familiar with the ovenbird, oftentimes people will say, why isn't this named a warbler? Where does it get its name? And it gets its name from its nest that looks like a little Dutch oven right on the ground, oddly. And you'd think, oh, why would they do that? That seems like just suicide. But I'll tell you, it's on my bucket list to find an ovenbird nest, and I still haven't found one. So I think they're pretty masterful at what they do. But they're olive green. When you first see an ovenbird, your mind might go to seeing a thrush. You might think you had a thrush. But then when you get a little bit better look, you notice that, oh my gosh, this bird's way more petite, slender. It has that tiny, slender, thin, sharp-pointed bill. And it clearly becomes something other than a thrush. And typically when that happens, you can go to the ovenbird. That's likely what you have. And this is one where the sexes are actually similar. So you're going to see the male or female. Now, while the males and females look alike, you're often, in most cases, like a lot of other birds, you're going to see the males calling more than the females do. In fact, while I label this as a lower understory bird, they will trick you. And especially later in the morning into the afternoon, when you hear an ovenbird calling, your mind will go low and you think it's got to be low. It's an ovenbird, but the males will actually sing higher into the middle of the day, higher up into the middle part of the canopy. So don't be afraid to look up a little bit, especially if it's later in the morning and you're in some ovenbird breeding grounds. Now, these guys have a really ear-piercing, very loud, repetitive call, and it sounds like they're saying, teacher, 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 and it gets louder and louder as they go. So let's listen to what that sounds like. Sound increases as it goes on. And it's incredibly loud in the forest, and it echoes through the forest, making it just incredibly difficult to pinpoint where you're hearing this bird. And you might take 10, 15, or 20 minutes before you find it, and then you wonder, how did I miss that bird? But look at the olive green. They like an older growth forest. And so they're in full shade, oftentimes, sitting on an open branch, and they blend in just so well. They're very, very hard to find. So in rich contrasty difference, we're going to go to one of the brightest colored warblers you will see, the prothonotary. And if you've missed migration at McGee, and maybe you had reasons not to go there for crowds or whatever reason, go back. And yes, a lot of the birds are probably through, but if you go to the nature center at that Maumee Bay, the state park there, a little bit west of McGee, they have a boardwalk leading away from the nature center, and there are several nesting pair of prothonotary warblers. So they're going to be there through June, calling, holding on to those territories. You can go and experience these birds very easily. The shot that you're going to see next was last week, and the bird was like 5 feet from us. And we experienced this several times while we were there. So something that you can do and very easily see these birds. Yes, ma'am.
I saw about 4 or 5 prothonotary at McGee.
Oh, excellent. So still there. And that was at McGee, the boardwalk? Oh, excellent. So someone in the crowd mentioned seeing 4 at McGee just yesterday. So yes, Juliet.
So I'm going to interject that we have a breeding population of prothonotary warblers along the Huron.
Okay,
And we'll have a prothonotary warbler paddle on June 11th,
awesome.
second Saturday in June. And last year we had 18 prothonotary warblers on a 6-mile paddle.
Incredible.
From Hudsonville down to Delaware.
So for those on Zoom, Juliet did mention that June 11th, they'll be doing a prothonotary focused walk and a paddle rather on the river, this is a perfect segue into this bird. So if you're willing to paddle, June 11th, last year they had 18 singing birds. So pretty exciting. So that's a perfect segue because these birds they're a cavity nester, and they prefer overhanging limbs over water. And so much like Juliet was talking about the Hudson, in my neck of the woods, that's the Kalamazoo River. We can do a float over maybe an hour and a half or so, 2 hours along the Kalamazoo River and have a similar experience where we might have a dozen or more singing prothonotaries with great views. So the tricky part of that is we can't welcome everybody to paddle down a river. Not everybody has the ability to do that. And so we have to find other ways to see them. So I'm so glad that you were able to see them at McGee along the boardwalk. They breed there as well. There are ways to see them without having to get on the water. But I love that they are found along the water, and a really beautiful example of when there's rich habitat along a river. They're absolutely bright. These are like sunshine birds to me. It can be as drab as if we had a prothonotary land in this tree outside in this drab, overcast evening, lack of light, it would be like a sun inside of that tree without any light hitting it. They're absolutely bright. And they're sunshine birds to me. That's how we describe them. But similar to the blue-winged warbler, they do have blue wings. But here's your test. What's missing on the wings that we saw on the blue-winged warbler? Right, I heard it. Someone said wing bars. No wing bars on this bird, okay? They are found in wooded swamps as well. We talked about the river habitats, but they do like cavities, and that's where they prefer to nest. Let's hear what they sound like. It is a 2-note pattern. But even though it's a 2-note pattern, to me, it sounds like they're saying, sweet, 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 sweet. I always hear sweet when they're doing their little, It's a 2-note pattern, but they're kind of like slurred together. And that's our prothonotary. All right, next is our hooded warbler. Obviously, aptly named if you're seeing a male for sure. And the only other bird that typically can confuse you with the hooded warbler is the common yellowthroat or maybe the Wilson's warbler. But the thing that both of those birds are lacking is what you're seeing under the neck. It's absolutely a hood that goes all the way around to their nape or back of the head and up on top. And that's our hooded warbler. So if you see that black all the way around on top and on the throat, without a doubt, east of the Mississippi, you have a hooded warbler. The females are paler. Are you kind of catching on about the females are the warblers? They often are paler, but they lack that hood, so they tend to be more yellow wash overall. These birds, similar to the ovenbird, like older growth deciduous forests, but they're a bird of the lower story. And so that's wonderful. When you hear the sweet, repetitive song of a hooded warbler, you have a good chance of seeing it, especially in breeding, because they breed lower and they spend their time lower in that deciduous forest. They also tend to be a little bit heavier bodied or stocky in the warbler world. So if you happen to see an ovenbird and then quickly see a hooded, you're going to think the hooded is bigger just by default. The only bird that sounds somewhat similar to that is a magnolia, and the magnolia is faster and a little harsher. There's something about the hooded warbler call that's just so sweet and delicate, like a whistle. And lastly, my favorite, part of what makes this my favorite warbler is I have them in our neck of the woods in Berry County, where I'm from. So they breed. I have put more people than I can count on cerulean warblers as life birds, and that's one of my favorite things to do in a bird walk is get people a life bird. And the cerulean's been that bird for many, many people. It's a very tough bird to get, and when you're not used to seeing them, you might have seen one, but your mind goes somewhere else because no, it can't be a cerulean. Well, you need to really pay attention. Remember at the beginning, we talked about looking at subtle details. This bird is awesome. One of my favorite things about this bird, even as frustrating as they are because of how high up they like to stay, when you get an underside view looking straight up, which is mostly what you're going to see, they are so long-winged that their wings look like they're hanging back outside away from their tail. Most of the other warblers don't position their wings that way, or they're not long enough to look that way. And the cerulean does this, and it's usually a telltale sign. However, they call all the time in their breeding grounds. Now, if you know where some ceruleans are, in fact, where they breed, your best bet is to find them early when they get there. So when I'm out looking for ceruleans on breeding grounds, it's the end of April, maybe the first couple of days of May, I'm going out trying to find the first ceruleans that have arrived. And the reason I do that, they're moving around the canopy, they're going low, they're going all over the place as they're figuring out where they want to set up their territory. And that's when you get the best views of these birds. So right now we're past that, I'm sad to say. However, you can still see them, they're just typically higher up if you can get movement amongst the leaf out. However, look at the rich blue coloration on the backs of these birds, just absolutely gorgeous. When you see them from underneath, oftentimes you don't get to see all that brilliant blue, but you will see a dark blue necklace that you won't see on these other birds. So that's another great piece of the puzzle that you can put together to figure out that you've got your cerulean. They're, again, often found very high in the canopy. And I was talking to some researchers from, I think it was the University of Kentucky, who were up doing some banding, and they were finding the most ceruleans on hillsides with slopes that wasn't flat ground. And so I thought that was really interesting. And in my neck of the woods, they like the older, dense forests, but they like having some understory underneath. And so that's where we look for these birds. Very buzzy call, one of my favorites. Classic cerulean. Okay, so let's move into our vireos. We're making good time tonight. So this is a yellow-throated vireo, and I don't know about you, but the first thing that I notice is it just looks stocky. And oftentimes the vireos can look stockier, but the yellow-throated vireo especially will look stocky. So when we look at vireos in general, I use that term stocky a lot. You know, I guess portly might be a good descriptor for them. The George Costanza of the birds, for you Seinfeld fans. They typically are larger than the warblers. But remember what I said about behavior at the beginning. That to me is everything for vireos. The first two things that I look at are how is the bird behaving and what does that bill look like? I always want to key in on that bill. And similar to what we talked about with the warblers, we look at that bill and what we're going to notice is that it's stockier, it's thicker, and it has that hook at the end. You won't always see that hook in the canopy, but you will notice that the bill overall is stockier. And if you've had time to notice all these things while the bird is sitting still, that's your other behavior trait that just clued you in that you likely have a vireo and not a warbler. Similar to warblers, though, they are typically found in forest canopies, and they mix in with warblers in migration. So at places like McGee, Taos, and so on and so forth, that's where it's a great study because you have warblers and vireos mixed in all at the same time, where once migration's done, the vireos and the warblers are on their breeding grounds. Yes, you can have overlap, certainly, but not to the extent of what we're seeing at fallout places like McGee, the Arbor, wherever you might be going. So that's another, helpful study in spring where you get them together. It's no different. It's similar. In fact, in the raptor world, in Michigan, if you go to any raptor migration site, you're going to see infinitely more sharp-shinned hawks than you will Cooper's hawks because they're a more northern breeding species. They're the ones who are migrating through these sites. So you can just judge your Sharpie versus Coop based on the numbers, and 90% of the time you're going to be right if you call a Sharpie in Michigan. Well, that's cheating in my mind. That's not a good study. And to have a good study, you need to go somewhere where Coops and Sharpies are more in even numbers. That would be Cape May, New Jersey, for one. And that will teach you to really study how to identify birds. So I want you to think about the same thing with vireos and warblers in spring migration. They're more mixed together, so they make for a great study. Okay, so we'll start with red-eyed, and I start with red-eyed for a very important reason. It was either going to be red-eyed or warblering, and look at that range map, and that is why. So when you look at the range map, red-eyed, very, very common bird. Warbling is probably even more common, but the red-eyed is important to start with because we're going to compare the song of the red-eyed to several others when we're struggling to figure out who we're hearing, because a few of these birds can sound very similar. And much like we would compare all other bootios in the raptor world to red-tailed hawks, we're going to do the same thing with the red-eyed vireo in the vireo world. So these birds are long-billed, but the crown on their heads appears flat. The olive green is really, really beautiful, but I will warn you that you rarely see them low enough to see that olive green. So if you do ever see a low red-eyed vireo, really look for the olive green back. I think it's a striking feature of these birds. They have a very dark, beautifully colored iris that is absolutely red. You see it there? Maybe barely. And I did that on purpose because you will rarely see the red in the iris of a red-eyed vireo because they're oftentimes not in the sun, they're in the shade, and they're far enough away that you just can't get the look. Oftentimes my photos of the birds, I can't see the red until I zoom in on the image and then, whoa, there's a red eye. So not exactly easy to see, but it is how they're aptly named. They are typically found in the middle to the upper story, but again, you're typically looking up at these birds. These birds sing constantly. I mean, to the tune of 20,000 times a day. They will just repetitively over and over and over and over call. So when I tell people when we're teaching bird songs, I always tell people to find a red-eyed vireo-like teacher. because you need them to say the bird over and over and over, and that's how you're going to learn it. And speaking of learning, I really want to encourage you. We've gone over a ton of warblers. We're going to go over a bunch of vireos. Don't walk away thinking, I need to learn all these birds. Walk away with a goal to learn 4 or maybe even 2 in a migration season. Do that every year, and you know what? 3 or 4 years later, you'll be surprised at how many you can pick out that start to become muscle memory. If you try to boil the ocean, it's never going to boil. So don't do that when you're learning anything bird related. Start small, and you'll be surprised at the small wins that you'll gain. So let's hear that call. Here I am, over here. Very sweet, not too sweet. I'm waiting for him to shut up. So it goes on and on. There's also not much space in between each one of their call patterns. So keep that in your mind, because the other ones typically that sound similar will have more space in between each call pattern. And so that time becomes something of a trick. So where there's no space in the sound or call of a bird, that's your warbler and vireo. They're, again, a great named bird because their call is exactly that. It's very warblering. They're extremely plain and dull. They are, if not one of the most dull vireos, especially east of the Mississippi. They're pretty small in comparison to things like a red-eyed and yellow-throated vireo. So if you see a very compact-looking bird, I think compact enough that they tend to confuse me with Tennessee warbler a lot, and we're going to look at those a little later side by side. So they're smaller in size, very pale, and speaking of pale, if you look at the eye stripe, it's there, but there's almost no contrast. It's very, very dull. So they do have an eye stripe or a spectacle, but it's very, very dull. So let's listen to what these birds sound like. You hear the warblering nature? Now look at that range map. Just awesome to see a bird that's that widespread. So a little different than something like a Kirtland's warbler, I'd say. All right, next is our white-eyed vireo. Now this is a vireo that you'll often see lower in the forest. Also around here, especially in our latitude, they tend to breed a little bit to the south. You can get breeding pairs up here. We have them in Iberia and Kalamazoo County, but not easily found. They're hard to find. And so typically when we see a white-eyed vireo, if I see a white-eyed vireo in migration in Michigan, I'm considering that more of an overshoot bird, where the bird's actually gone past its nesting grounds, weather related, who knows why, and they'll eventually find their way back. Who knows what time will tell. We are starting to see more and more breed in southern Michigan, so who knows. But hopefully in this video or in this photo, you can see the white iris and the white-eyed vireo, and that is pretty noticeable if you get a decent view of these birds. It also helps that there's sunlight on it. And these birds, in terms of males and females, only the males will sing on territory. So you might hear either a male or a female sing in migration, but oftentimes I don't hear white-eyed vireos in migration. I only see them. And then once we're on nesting grounds, if we hear a white-eyed vireo, it's always a male. I also thought it was interesting that these birds, to clean their feathers and bathe, they actually do it by rubbing against dew-covered foliage, which I thought was really an interesting way to bathe. Look at the white wing bars. They tend to be a little gray dull on the nape or the back of the head or the neck there. They have a whitish, kind of a pale whitish throat, but they just tend to look yellowish overall. So if you have a vireo that's pale yellow overall, first think about white-eyed vireo. So they have a little bit more of a raspy, buzzy call with some sweet interjections throughout. almost sounds mockingbird, catbirdish in a way. But again, I don't typically hear them much in migration. It's more on their breeding grounds where I hear them call. And we've talked a little bit about the yellow-throated. This is the more stocky, portly vireo. And what's really cool about yellow-throated vireos, they tend to spend more time towards the middle of the tree, middle meaning towards the trunk. And you'll find them away from the trunk, but on thin branches that are not leafed at all. So if you get under the tree and kind of inside it where you think you're hearing a yellow-throated, it pays to look more towards the center of the tree, not the leafy canopy. They are found in the middle to the upper story. I find they tend to be pretty high. So unless you're at a spot with really low trees in migration, you're likely going to have to look pretty high to find a yellow-throated vireo. But that yellow throat is everything. It wraps all the way around their head. While it does get pale on their nape and on their cap, it is still yellowish on top. But then they have this cool kind of change on their wings and their back where it goes bluish gray. And so if you just close your eyes and then open them and look at this bird on the screen, you'll just see yellow and blue. And so it can kind of lead you to think blue-winged warbler or prothonotary, things like that. But at the end of the day, these are birds that you're not going to see together. Maybe the hooded, but the hooded is going to be much lower in the canopy, and the yellow-throated vireo is going to be higher. The bright yellow throat and clear spectacle around the eye is really diagnostic for these birds. Now, remember I said we're going to compare some birds to the red-eyed vireo. The red-eyed vireo is very repetitive, sings over and over. Remember I said there's very little space in between each call pattern. Now let's listen to the yellow-throated vireo. It sounds like a red-eyed vireo with a sore throat. It's raspy and a little rougher, but there's more time in between each call pattern. So it's those pauses that we want to listen for. And again, as a classic vireo, they're going to sit on that open branch kind of in the center of the tree, and they're going to sit and wait. They're not going to move around as much. They're going to wait for the insects to come to them. Next up, another spectacled bird with that white eye ring. Just a beautiful representation of a vireo. It has all the vireo traits. However, you get this beautiful blue head, which just another aptly named bird, the blue-headed vireo. Notice their range map. So we see them in migration, and that's about it. You've got to go up into the upper lower peninsula or into the UP if you want to go after blue-headed vireos on their nesting grounds. Look for that dark head, that dark grayish blue head. The other thing that I always notice about these birds is the difference in contrast and color between the head and the chest. The chest and the belly are very, very white, very brightly white. And then when you look at that blue head, it's often very contrasty dark compared to the white chest. So with all that white and that dark head, oftentimes that's a real quick way to know that you've got a blue-headed. They tend to be more in the middle story or the middle part of the canopy. And also notice the white wing bars that you'll see on these birds. This is another one that sounds similar to our red-eyed, okay? However, similar to the yellow-throated vireo, there are longer pauses in between each call pattern. But unlike the yellow-throated vireo, each call pattern is very, very sweet. Sweeter sounding than the red-eyed even, but then we have those pauses. Nowhere near as harsh as that yellow-throated bird. So let's study these again. We're going to hear these calls again. In fact, we're even going to throw in a Philadelphia vireo. And let's listen to them one at a time and try and notice things. Try to really, even if you're willing, close your eyes and listen to little subtle details of each call. If we're going to start with our red-eyed, and remember the red-eyed is going to sing over and over very repetitively. There's very little space or pause in between each call pattern. All right, now let's hear the even sweeter blue-headed vireo. Less call patterns, more pause in between each. And lastly, the vireo with the sore throat, our yellow-throated vireo. Oh, excuse me, Philly first. Shoot. It's hurried. I'm gonna play the Philadelphia again. It's sweet, similar to the blue-headed, similar to the red-eyed. It's a little bit more hurried with pauses in between. This is a great group of birds to put into lark wire and do over and over and over and over. Lastly, our sore throat bird, the yellow-throated. Hear the roughness? To me, the yellow-throated and the red-eyed are the most different. And so they're, to me, the easiest ones of the four. The other two, blue-headed and Philly, they're the ones who give me trouble as well. So don't frustrate yourself too much if you call it wrong. Be willing to call them. Sometimes being wrong is the best learning lesson that you can give yourself. Now, in terms of sight, there is a trio, as I call it, that tend to look very similar. And we're going to throw that Tennessee in there, especially as it relates to the Warbler and Virio. And that's for a couple reasons. One, we are going to see infinitely less Philadelphia Vireos here than red-eyed, warbling, yellow-throated, and Tennessee warbler in migration. Philadelphia Vireo is a dandy bird to see, I assume, around here as well as it is in my neck of the woods. And when we're comparing a Philadelphia to a warbling, these are the two that often will trip us. Part of what trips us is when we have leaf out and the sun is coming through, you're getting all kinds of green reflections that end up on the birds. They can make warbling vireos look awful yellow underneath. In fact, they can make every bird look yellow underneath. So you have to be very careful, especially under leaf out. However, having said that, the Philadelphia vireo always appears yellow under the throat and chest, whereas the warbling vireo always shows yellow more in the flanks. So if you see what you think is a Philadelphia vireo, but it clearly has white on the throat, you need to think again. If you think you have a warbling vireo that has rich yellow color on the throat and less yellow on the flanks, you need to think about a Philadelphia vireo, and that could be a dandy bird you're sitting in front of. Also notice the contrasty difference between the stripe through the eye on the Philadelphia versus the paler stripe on the warbling vireo. Some people will, because of the shorter, stubbier bill of the Philadelphia vireo, they'll describe it as the head looks more like that of a kinglet instead of a vireo. And you can kind of see that here. It almost looks golden crown kinglet to me versus the warbling vireo looks more like a classic vireo face. Lastly, our Tennessee. So look at the difference in the beak on this bird compared to the other two vireos on screen. It's slender, it's coming to a nice point. Very white, palish gray and white underneath with this beautifully subtle olive green on the back and the wings. I love Tennessee warblers. I think it's subtle beauty. And while they're very drab compared to the other warblers, I think there's a beauty there that often goes overlooked. But the best thing in determining that you have a Tennessee warbler and not one of these vireos is by its call. And when we play this call, listen to the difference between what this sounds like versus those four vireos that we just went over. Crazy. And it pays to learn that call. in migration, they call like crazy and you hear them all over the place. It sounds like they're saying 10, 10, 10, 10, C, 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 C. And I love my 10-year-old daughter is really getting into birds. And I mean, if you've ever experienced a young person like this learning, who wants to learn birds, it doesn't take them much. I mean, she's identifying everything. And even by song, and she'll hear a Tennessee and just start saying 10, 10, 10, 10, C, 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 C. I love it. However, that call is just incredibly different from any vireo you're going to hear. And so that's another piece of that puzzle. So don't be afraid to use more than sight, more than shape, more than colors. Think about bird songs, use lark choir, and really challenge yourself on a small scale to learn a few birds each migration. And it's really once a year, because you're not going to hear them singing in fall. And oh, by the way, their colors are going to be different in some of them. So that to me is more frustrating than the bird songs. So give those songs a try. So that's what I have for you tonight. I hope that that was a good precursor into some vireos, especially, and some of the warblers that could still be viewed. And I think we can take some questions. If maybe we could turn some lights on. Perfect. That's enough light. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions about this topic or anything? Yeah.
I want to mention that Charles has,
DVDs and Blu-rays. Yeah. Not Warbler related, but I do. For those that don't know, I have a movie called Hawks on the Wing. And what makes it unique is the ability to see two raptors flying side by side on the screen at the same time, while my audio commentary talks you through how to decipher each species. That's a really cool feature. Certainly not as, the best thing is going to a migration site with someone and learning on the fly. But to see it on video instead of just seeing a picture in a book, I think is pretty cool. So thank you, Juliet. I have a fan. Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, good. Great. Well, thank you very much. It's hard to do ID presentations. They're not the funnest presentation, but they're really important. So sometimes it's good to just focus, and I think it was good to do both warblers and vireos. Oftentimes it's one or the other. So any questions? Sure. Kudos on all of your media. Was the audio yours? No. That's all from, in fact, that's from the Stokes CDs. So right before phones, the smartphone technology really hit, I was really just into doing these kinds of presentations. I needed the audio, and I wanted the audio in the field for my own learning, because I really was working on bird songs, and all the CDs, Stokes included, had their voice at the beginning saying, Tennessee warbler, and then you hear the call. Well, I don't want to hear that. I want to hear the call. And so I painstakingly went through every single one of them in my audio software and removed the voiceover, only to find out like 2 months after that these apps came out with just the calls. But it paid off, because I use these all the time in teaching. And so I still am glad I did the work. Oh. Yeah, it's a good question. Question about the camera gear that I use. So most all of my bird images are with what's called prime lenses, meaning they don't zoom. And so 300, 400, and 500 millimeter. And the reason for that, new photographers might think, man, you don't get to, have that reach between ranges. Well, with birds, they're never close enough, ever. And a prime lens has less glass elements, meaning you get better quality. So if you want the best quality image, a prime lens is the way to go. In terms of my camera bodies, I shoot Canon, and I have shot with the 5D full frame, but most of the time I was shooting with my 7D Mark II And I've recently switched to a mirrorless that I'm really starting to dial into. So, Juliet, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm experiencing that Merlin sound ID.
Ah. It is.
You can talk about, some of the advantages and some of the pitfalls.
Sure. Yeah. So Juliet's asked about Merlin. It's really exploding in terms of use. I will be very honest with you. I'm not a Merlin fan. What I don't like about Merlin doesn't have anything to do with whether it's good or bad at what it does. It's incredible, really, at what it does. It's very cool on the surface. My issue with Merlin is I feel like you're not learning anything and you're simply given an answer. And oftentimes I'm finding people just trust that answer too. And if they have a recording of the song, it's surprising to me how often it's wrong. Not because I'm right and it's wrong, because it's literally the wrong song and people agree. However, advantages of it, you know, when you're, I liken myself, you know, I remember back to the days where I'm completely confused. I have no idea what I'm saying. I have no idea what I'm hearing. You know, if it gives you some comfort into getting that, you know, learning process going, then I have nothing, I can't have anything against that. So I think, I love what you said, advantages and maybe some pitfalls. Those are my opinions. I typically would rather learn from someone who can give me reasons why I'm hearing what I'm hearing. In addition to that, I'll give you an example of, remember when I was talking about teaching bird songs and I said, find a red-eyed vireo-like teacher, meaning someone who's willing to repeat and tell you what you're hearing over and over, so it sticks in. My favorite story I always tell when bird songs talk is probably more than a decade ago now. My wife and I were floating down the Manistee River, and she made a deliberate decision before we got on the water to tell me, point out every single song sparrow you hear. Okay. It was mind-blowingly annoying. There were so many, it was just constant. But you know what? After a 2-hour float, she's never had to ask what a song sparrow is ever again. So remember when I said, don't boil the ocean, don't try to eat an elephant in one bite? This is what I'm talking about. And she made a deliberate choice that day to learn one bird. And in the 2-hour float, I've never had to point out a song sparrow for her ever again. So if that doesn't, I mean, it gives me chills because I love that teaching moment, but that is the way to learn, in my opinion. I think most people try to overdo it. I mean, my first time to McGee Marsh, we listened to bird songs the whole way, the 2-hour drive there. And I got out all cocky and confident, like, this is nothing. And the first bird I heard, I was like, what is that? And I had heard it seemingly 20 times on the way. So again, you know, be willing to fail, start small, pick a couple birds to learn each spring. And yeah, it'll take a few years, but it doesn't take but a few years. And all of a sudden you'll start to, oh, muscle memory. That's a chickadee. That's a titmouse. That's a cerulean warbler. That's a common yellowthroat. Those, you'll start to have those wins. That'll make you want to learn more and you'll grow as a birder. So would you like to share anything, your opinions about Merlin? I kind of went off there. Maybe you could come up, Juliet.
Yeah, so Merlin Sound ID especially is really exploding, and it's fabulous as a way to let you know that there's a bird singing nearby. But don't stop there. Record the bird, find the bird, listen to it, see what it looks like. Don't let it tell you what the bird is because it can be wrong. And you're missing that learning opportunity to figure out, is that really the bird I'm seeing or hearing, or is it something else? Right. Yeah.
So another takeaway then to that, another takeaway, even if you really are finding Merlin to be a great tool for you, check it with other birds that may be around. Hey, Merlin says, I heard this. This is really exciting. Do you agree? So record it. Talk to other people. Find the bird. Learn about it. You know, there's nothing worse to me than a bird trip where it's quantity over quality. Oh, I heard it. Let's go. Next one. I want to see what the darn thing's doing, because you never know what they do. And more often than not, when you sit and experience one bird, you'd be surprised at how many other things you see. So my style is qualitative birding. I may not get 200 species. I might get half that, but I guarantee you I had some really interesting experiences with the birds that I saw. And to me, that's just infinitely more fun. I kind of went off there. Yeah.
I actually had a counterpoint. I agree with you.
Mhm.
I was at the
Mhm.
I like doing the song. I like to listen for it.
Mhm.
I have a Merlin back in my hand. And every time it flew to Tennessee, in my own list, it would flash right.
Very
And
cool.
so then I was like, wait, I can't look under it, and then I have to look that way.
That's cool.
And then opens another one, then it flashes.
Ah,
All I do is usually flash.
wow. I didn't know it did that. That's pretty cool.
But so
Yeah.
that's just gonna have to-
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's really cool. I'm glad you shared that. Could they hear you? Probably not. Okay. So Jessica did share that there is a feature in the Merlin app where it will flash when it hears a specific bird song. So when she was at McGee, hearing a lot of Tennessees, it would flash. She'd hear it and then she'd see the flash giving her that cue. Oh, yep, that's what I heard, which is a cool learning moment, honestly.
You have to first know that that's what you're seeing.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, very cool. And it's only going to get better. I mean, it's all AI, which is kind of scary, but it's only going to get better. And, you know, I'm probably going to turn into one of the, you know, old school folks from at some point, and I just, you know, prefer a little different way of doing it. But that's really good to know. Any other questions or anything on?
One of the Zoom, absolutely, what you showing me, my question was where did you know?
It's Central and South America, I believe. Central? Yeah. Yeah. It did get truncated. But, you know, I am hooked on. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Central America for sure. You can't see that. Oh, yeah. Way down into South America. Yep. I'll have to redo that range map.
Yeah, you just have the migration.
I do. The winter grounds aren't there. And they migrate. So I was wrong. They actually migrate through Central America, but they winter in South America. So yeah, good call. Beautiful bird. And that bird, April 29th, telling you low, they're flying around, they're all over the place in the canopy when they first get back. So that's the only reason that bird's on that branch. Okay. Any last questions? Yes, ma'am.
I want to put it at the beginner of this, so, you know, the question for elementary. But if I'm listening to a bird that how can I tell if it's a scarlet tanager and not a vireo? Is it a cadence kind of thing?
That's part of it. Cadence, you hear me talking about sweet versus harsh, or scarlet tanager. Oftentimes people will describe that as a American robin with a sore throat. Scratchy. So that's your word. So I say harsh or raspy. That doesn't do it for you.
Right.
Scratchy does it for you. And I love that because you have to find what makes sense to you.
Because one of those warblers
Absolutely.
You just have to keep-
It's practice and you figuring out ways to describe things that make sense to you. In the raptor world, we're doing raptor migration ID, flight ID, stiff wing beat versus, a floppy wing beat. That's kind of an easier one. Stiff is stiff, floppy is floppy, but you have to kind of develop your own process, and a lot of it's practice. That's what I like so much about LarkWire, because that technology is testing you, and you can just hit and go over and over. And what happens is you'll hear a song and you'll have these buttons with pictures of the birds, and you have to click on the bird and it'll tell you if you're wrong or right away, and then keep doing it over and over. It's a cool tool, and there's others out there.
When you were playing the black hole.
Yeah.
I thought that sounds just like a caveman.
Yeah, it's similar. Yeah, certainly. And to me, it's that repetitive nature. It's just like the same thing over and over and over. Super, super high. Yeah, it's very similar, Cape May. Yeah. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Seriously, like so many birders that I'm around, especially, I guess my experience, especially at places like McGee or, the well-known areas, more often than not, birders are super nice, willing to help kind of people. Rarely will you come across kind of a curmudgeon person who just, is there to be on their own. It can happen, but for the most part, that's rare. So, yes.
You need not worry. If time comes and you will see that upgrade to technology already.
Already there? Oh, good to hear. That's awesome. Now, tell me, how do I convince my 74-year-old dad that he needs them? He just refuses.
I'll just tell you, and that's where neural map is actually pretty easy because not only will it flash, but you also see the song as it goes across the screen. And then you're staring at the audiogram or song going across the screen and you do not hear it. It's pretty convincing.
Well, I might have, he's coming to Tawas with me this weekend. I might have to do that. I'm trying to figure it out. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
This weekend, I just get known,
Yeah.
and I'm watching, I didn't have my internet, I'm watching kind of black and white. And go across the screen and then flashing just like this.
Unreal.
And I grab my internet, put it on, but it's perfect.
Wow. That is exciting. Really good. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here, and I'll be around for a little while if you guys want to chit chat. I'll put my mask back on. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. Wonderful program. Everyone please help us with the chair today, and then we can socialize a little bit before